This presentation coming up is for our quality payment program, and it's a MIPS program review. Next slide, please. We have a number of people on the quality team, and our presenter today is Kelly Fountain, who is our lead quality team advisor, and she's been with the Kentucky REC for over 6.5 years. She works with practices in developing and implementing strategic plans for process improvement, practice innovation, and quality improvement projects such as alternative payment models, quality, and value-based care programs. Next slide, please. Take it away, Kelly.
Thank you, Catherine. All right, so we have kind of a lot to cover in this session, and I'll try to provide some good background context. As Brent mentioned, the notice for proposed rulemaking did drop as of Monday evening of last week. So we are all diligently reading and making our recommendations and analyzing for kind of impact across the state. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that our NPRM webinar is actually going to be August 27th from 12:30 to 1:30 Eastern Standard Time. And it's open to everybody. And you can register on our website. So we're going to start off with MIPS Basics, which is just going to be that kind of foundation. Then we'll talk a little bit about the performance categories, some key dates, and then next steps. And go on to the next slide, please. So let's start with the very basic foundation. So the Quality Payment Program was actually created by the macro legislation. And the macro legislation essentially created two main tracks under that QPP. So first is MIPS, or that merit-based incentive payment system, which is where most people actually fall. Now with this track in particular, the thing to keep in mind is that your payment adjustments are awarded based off of your performance across 4 performance categories. And it is an adjustment that takes place 2 years after your reporting of that information to CMS. Now on the other side is advanced APMs. Now advanced APM in particular, or alternative payment model, is really, there's an incentive for participating in these alternative models. So you're not seeing the same type of payment adjustment associated with participation in that side. This is one of the many distinctions between those two tracks of the Quality Payment Program. Next slide, please. Okay, so the very first thing is understanding eligibility. First, you have to be an eligible clinician type. That's the very first step, or be part of a group that has multiple eligible clinicians. Now, those clinicians are going to include physicians, chiropractors, PAs, nurse practitioners, registered dietitians, just to name a few. In addition to that, you have to have been enrolled in Medicare, so billing Medicare, and you have to essentially have a certain volume of Medicare patients or Medicare Part B billing. Now, if you are part of or participating in advanced APM, that is going to have an impact on your eligibility for the MIPS track. Next slide, please. So these are the low volume criteria. You have to meet or exceed all 3 of these criteria in order to be eligible or required to participate in the program. First is $90,000 in Medicare Part B. The second is 200 Medicare patients. And the third and final is 200 covered services. Again, you have to meet all 3 of those or exceed them in order to be deemed an eligible clinician. Now, CMS is going to look at 2 different snapshots to determine whether or not you're eligible. And they're actually going to give you an eligibility status twice during the year. So that first snapshot would be October 1st of 2018 through September 30th of 2019. And then the second snapshot is actually going to run October 1st, 2019 through September 30th of 2020. There's always kind of a long stretch. Now, in order to avoid the penalty, because that's oftentimes what everybody's focusing on, and then the second focus is becoming an exceptional performer, we'll see that this program has progressed. With the very first year of this program, you only had to have 3 points out of a possible 100 points to avoid the penalty. And you only had to have 70 points or higher to be deemed an exceptional performer. Now, this is a budget neutral program, so those that receive the penalty actually fund the positive payment adjustment outside of the exceptional performer category. So for 2020, which is the year we're actively participating in, and it's already August, we're looking at having to get a minimum of 45 points in order to avoid the penalty. And in order to be that exceptional performer, you have to get 85 points or higher. Now that's out of 100 possible points. So you'll see there's been a significant shift over the last couple years. And I'll tell you, based off of the notice for proposed rulemaking, this is not changing too much. We are going up just as usual. Every year we step up just a little bit. Now what's at risk is 9%, so keep that in mind. Now you can participate in this program in several different ways. You can actually participate in multiple different options. So you can participate at the individual level, so think NPI. You can participate at the group level, which is NPIs that come together that bill underneath the tax ID, or a virtual group. Now CMS typically responds or sees virtual groups and groups kind of under the same lens. So when you're reading on a fact sheet or something like that, they typically refer to virtual groups and groups as the same type of entity. Next slide, please. Okay, so now each of the 4 performance categories has a different submission type and submitter type. And these are really kind of set at the performance level. So if you take quality, for example, you have the option to submit using direct, login and upload, CMS web interface for large practices, or Medicare Part B claims for small practices only. And this can be done by the individual NPI, the group representative, or even a third-party intermediary. And you may be thinking, what is a third-party intermediary? That's somebody that you've contracted to submit on your behalf. So if you're using a registry, for example, oftentimes they will submit on your behalf, and then we just recommend you go in and you check and verify that everything looks good in the system. For promoting interoperability and improvement activities in particular, you have an option that's a little bit different than quality, and that's that login and attest. And this is going to be the most similar to historical programs or even current programs such as the Promoting Interoperability for Medicaid for EPs. You log in, you enter numerators and denominators. You can also upload it as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about the shifts across the 4 categories. We talked about the fact that your score, your final score, is based out of 100. Now, initially, quality made up 60% of your final score, whereas for 2020, we're looking at 45%. I will go ahead and give you a little bit of a heads up. That's going to continue to change and shift throughout the years. Promoting interoperability and improvement activities are remaining relatively stable unless you're a part of an APM. You're looking at 25% for promoting interoperability, 15% for improvement activities, and cost is continuing to stair step up just a little bit. Now, again, cost doesn't require any submission. It's based off your claims data. Next slide, please. So there are a couple of things to consider, or high level, if you will. And I'm not going to go through all of the details on this. It's really just so that you have a point of reference when we're talking about the different categories. The very basics for quality is that you must submit at least 6 applicable quality measures. Now, this should have a giant asterisk next to it, because if you're part of or participating in a specialty measure set, you may have more or less quality measures, and that's perfectly fine. What you want to make sure is you have at least 1 outcome or high priority measure. Additional ones are better if you can, because they do actually carry bonus points. Your score is based off of your performance, and currently the quality performance is set off of a historical benchmark across the nation. And it's very specific to the method of collection and submission. So if you use your EHR, for example, there's going to be a benchmark associated with EHR submissions. Your target is to essentially get as many points as possible for each of those measures. Each measure can go up to 10 points for base, and then you can get bonus points for end-to-end electronic as well as high priority. Promoting interoperability, your target is to get at least 100 raw points. That's become a little bit more difficult over the last couple of years. You really only have 5 bonus points available at this moment, and you have to participate in 4 objectives and 5 to 6 subset measures. You do have to have a 2015 cert So that's something to really consider. Improvement activities is perhaps the easiest category at this point in time. However, in the past rulemaking processes, CMS has kind of tightened or strengthened the requirements around this category. So for example, you do now have to have at least 50% of your eligible clinicians participating in the same improvement activity for at least 90 consecutive days if you are participating at the group level. This is a huge burden for documentation. And then finally, cost is actually comprised of 20 different measures right now, and you're only going to be evaluated on the measures that you have enough cases in. And it's purely based off of claims. So there's no submission that you have to do. It's just purely based off of what you're paid for and the outcomes associated with each of those cost measures. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about kind of quality in particular. And the next couple of slides are really going to be focused each for one category. So we've already talked about at least 6 measures. In addition to that, you want to make sure you have 70% data completeness. You have at least 1 outcome or high priority measure. It does require 365 days of reporting. Now, the good news is most systems have a way to capture retroactively that information. So just because you may have a delay of getting your reports doesn't mean that you don't have information there. You just want to confirm with your vendor to make sure everything is good to go. So the measures are actually defined by the collection type as far as performance. So historically speaking, if you're looking at web interface, you're going to be evaluated against everybody else that's participating in web interface. Same with EHR Direct. Now scoring, again, each measure as a raw score can run from 0 points to 10 points, where 10 points would be the preferred, obviously, and that would fall in decile 10. There is a 3-point floor right now, and CMS is still proposing to keep that, and that's if you don't meet the minimum case threshold, you get at least 3 points. That's helpful for a lot of small practices in particular. Now, there are small practice bonuses associated with this category, as well as additional points associated with outcome and high priority, and then end-to-end bonus. Again, just to reiterate, it makes up 45% of your final score. Next slide, please. So let's talk about promoting interoperability. Promoting interoperability is, as many of you I'm sure know, kind of builds off the foundation of historical programs. It has since changed quite a bit since it was originally rolled out. And for those of you that have been participating in this program for a while, you know about advancing care information and the change over to promoting interoperability. A couple of things that you want to make sure you have is that you have to have a 2015 certified EHR. That is required. You must have that at the start and the end of your reporting timeframe. For this one in particular, you just have to have 90 consecutive days. It can take place anytime during the performance year. So for 2020, that would be anywhere from January 1st of 2020 through December 31st of 2020. Now, if you're looking at that last time frame, you're really going to want to try and capture the data starting no later than October 1st or 2nd. It does require you to have a patient portal. It does require you to have the API functionality turned on. There are main 4 objectives with 6 subset measures. It does require that security risk analysis. So Amy and Seth were talking about performing an SRA earlier. This is a must pass. If you don't perform an SRA, you cannot get any points for this category. And just to remind you, this is 25 points out of a possible 100. It is a large chunk of your performance. So don't let that be the one thing that holds you back. Now, something that's a little bit different as the program has grown up, if you will, and it's evolved, we have seen that we've went from base, bonus, performance kind of scoring, where you started off with pretty much 50 points if you were doing okay. Now it's straight performance. That means each of the measures carry a specific weight, and your percentage performance is kind of weighted against it. So, for example, for HIE, send and receive, that's up to 40 points. If you were to get, I don't know, 50% on that, you would only get half of those points. And the goal is to try and get at least 100 raw points to get full credit in this performance category. And there's really only 5 points available for bonus. So really have to do as best as possible across these 4 objectives and subset measures. There are some exclusions that are available, but they're a little less than last year. In particular, the second HIE exclusion is no longer available. Next slide, please. All right, improvement activities. Improvement activities is one of those things that ideally we try to encourage folks to align with the rest of their performance. So for example, if you were to manage diabetic patient population, there are a whole host of improvement activities that actually support driving improvements on A1C poor control, for example. Now, you can, of course, as Vance pointed out and Kristen earlier in this week, receive full credit for this category, which is 15%, if you are certified as PCMH or PCSP for the program year. Now, if you're participating at the group level, you want to make sure at least 50% of your service locations are certified in order to get that credit. Now, let's say you're thinking, Kelly, I don't have 50% of my service locations certified. That's okay. But really the nice thing about this performance category, and honestly PCMH and PCSP, is that a lot of the foundational basis for becoming recognized as PCMH or PCSP are actually improvement activities. So just seeking out getting that certification is enough to actually get you credit. Now, each of the measures carry a weight, and that weight can be anywhere from 10 points for medium weighted or 20 points for high weighted. Now, I will tell you, most of the measures are actually going to be medium weighted, and that's okay. But this is kind of impacted by your special status. So if you're participating in a rural area, if you're a small practice in particular, it's actually going to double that weight. And your goal is to try and get at least 40 raw points within this category. And that typically means you have to attest to 2 to 4 improvement activities, but sometimes you can get away with just 1 if you have a high weighted activity. Because these aren't a huge lift as far as kind of actually incorporating them into your practice, I always recommend that you do 1 extra if you can. The biggest challenge with this category is just documentation. Typically, there's not a report that you can generate from your EHR to support that you are doing an improvement activity. So it's important to have that documentation at the start of your 90 days, midway through those 90 days, and at the very end. And that's going to include screenshots. There's a whole host of recommendations that we can walk you through for each of those improvement activities. All you have to do is reach out, and we're happy to help with that. Next slide, please. All right, so cost. I think cost is one of everybody's least favorite category, at least it is mine. And CMS keeps changing this one on us. So for those of you that have been around for a little bit longer, the value-based modifier was kind of the foundation of the historical context for this performance category. It is based off of claims. It's looking at Medicare Part A and Part B, and it's really kind of a 365-day snapshot with a run-out period. You don't get any feedback right now on how you're performing on cost until after the fact. So you really don't have a great way to keep a pulse check on this. Now, it is kind of, in the last couple of years, CMS has shifted things around. So it used to be that attribution was set at the high level. So for MSPBC, for example, or total per capita cost, you would have a kind of an attribution methodology. Now we're looking at every single one of those 20 measures has their own attribution methodology, has its own way of having a case minimum, as well as kind of the benchmarking associated with it. So one of the things we like to recommend is that you look at your feedback from CMS and they will tell you what you've been evaluated on. If you're evaluated on something, chances are you will continue to be evaluated on it as in the future, and it's something that you want to monitor. Again, this is something that you really have to utilize that feedback, and CMS has said that they're going to try and make efforts to provide additional feedback in real time. The last final rule they released said monthly. I've yet to see it roll out just yet, but we did just now get our feedback reports for 2019. So fingers crossed we'll start to get more additional information on this category in the future. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about at the very beginning of this presentation, advanced payment or alternative payment models. Typically there's an advanced in front of that. And we talked about how they have different thresholds, how they are evaluated slightly different. The long-term goal here of this program is to shift from volume-based care to value-based care. Now, the 4 categories CMS has heard are very disjointed, right? You have to have this many points for this category, this many for that category. And it's very difficult for a very busy practice manager or clinician to keep straight all of the requirements of this program. And long-term, how is this actually going to help improve patient outcomes and reduce costs and administrative burden? Well, CMS has said that they are rolling out in the next couple of years MIPS value pathways. MIPS value pathways are really a way to prepare to move into alternative-based payments. So it initially starts with looking at specific patient populations, and that's typically where you have successful APMs, is if they're looking and focusing on, excuse me, primary care services, or they're looking at end-stage renal disease, a very narrow type of patient population. Then you're able to kind of focus in on that, and you align your improvement activities with that patient population you're trying to manage. You focus on using your EHR to really help manage that patient population. You are attuned to those cost measures. You know when those patients in particular are getting admitted into the ER, and then your quality measures ideally align with your goals. Now, all of this is in an effort to try and make stepwise or systematic approach towards these alternative payment models. And this is important because CMS is building these blocks as we're going to get you prepared for that shift from volume to value. That shift hasn't 100% taken place yet, so you kind of have to keep your feet in both areas, and that's important to consider. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of spend a little bit of time of talking about the key dates in particular for this program. Now, it can be slightly confusing because you have your performance capture period, which is always January 1st through December 31st of the program year. So for 2020 program year, that's running January 1st, 2020 through December 31st of 2020. You have a time frame that's typically from January 2nd to March 31st the following year to attest or submit that data to CMS. So it's always after you've collected the data. You don't typically get your feedback reports until later in the summer after the year of the attestation. And then you see changes like we are going through right now made for the prior following program year, depending on the NPRM and the final rule. So for example, at the beginning of August, CMS did drop a notice for proposed rulemaking for program year 2020 and program year 2021. And keep in mind, we are currently in program year 2020. So that's something that CMS likes to throw our way. It's some tweaks historically and current as well. Now, we have a 60-day comment period, which means we have until October 1st of 2020 to submit our comments based off of this proposed rule. There are significant changes, so I encourage you, if you have the time, to join us on August 27th from 12:30 to 1:30 Eastern Time to really dig into all of the major changes around 2020 program year and 2021 program year that are currently proposed. Now, CMS typically releases a final rule in around November, to be honest, and so November 1st is normally when we look to see that. And that final rule, after published, typically within 60 days becomes legally binding. CMS wrote into the notice for proposed rulemaking this year that they're proposing to shorten that time frame from 60 days to 30 days. So it's a little bit shorter time frame in hopes to have everything finalized prior to December 31st of 2020. Now, a couple of things to kind of consider. You have eligibility, and I talked about this earlier. Eligibility is going to be through those 2 snapshots. Snapshot 1 typically happens sometime in April. Snapshot 2 typically happens sometime in December, and this is your final snapshot, and it determines your final eligibility. And this is important because, again, it's looking at 2 different time frames. So if your billing volumes have changed, if your volumes of patients have changed, if your clinicians have come and gone, that is going to ultimately impact your eligibility in that second and final snapshot. And that is the legally binding snapshot, if you will. Now, if you are eligible in the first snapshot and you're not eligible in the second snapshot, you have some options. You can choose to not report and avoid penalty, or you can choose to opt in if you are eligible and participate fully in the program. Don't recommend opting in unless you know that you are going to perform really well. Because if you opt in, you're not only opting in for the possible positive payment adjustment, but you're also opting in for the possible negative payment adjustment. And to remind you, that's 9% right off the top of your Medicare Part B. So quite substantial. Now, legislative updates are one of those things that are always kind of in the works. Typically, there's one NPRM for this program a year, and there's one final rule for this program a year. Sometimes, like we've seen in the past, if COVID-19 happens, for example, and CMS releases kind of add-ons to additional or different programs in PRMs and final rules that impacts this program. So you may have seen when COVID-19 first came out, as far as the guidance from CMS, that we provided some feedback around that because we know that COVID-19, and especially the shift to telecare or telehealth, has an impact on your performance in these categories. CMS is still recognizing that and are actually baking in additional flexibility for the next couple years due to COVID-19 and its potential impact on cost and quality for sure. Performance feedback. Okay, performance feedback, you get your feedback sometime in August typically, and CMS will say that it's your final performance feedback, but there'll be an asterisk with that. Now there's an asterisk because you actually have a time frame to do a targeted review. And if you do that targeted review, or somebody does that targeted review, and their score is changed, then everybody's payment adjustment changes as well, because it's a budget neutral program. So I always like to say that you'll know what your final payment adjustment is actually January 1st of the year that it will be applied. And sometimes January 2nd is more likely. So you may have an idea of what it will be, but you don't know exactly what the final is. And I say this because in the past, we've seen the payment adjustments change quite dramatically in between the first release, the second release, and the final release. And for example, for 2019, I don't know how many of you have looked at your feedback reports, they have changed because there was that hardship that was available due to COVID-19 at the very end of the reporting timeframe. Nobody was really assessed a penalty. And because nobody was really assessed a penalty, the budget neutral part of that program that funds that payment adjustment is not there. So really the only way you're seeing any positive payment adjustment is for those folks that fall in that exceptional performer category. And that's going to be the same for the next couple years because CMS is baking in some flexibility for COVID-19 and for practices that are dealing with this weird world we're in right now. Next slide, please. So there are a couple things that we like to recommend as best practices. And honestly, the very first thing is to submit for last year, get that out of the way, and then start looking at selecting your measures and pulling those spec sheets for each and every one of those measures. Those are going to change annually. They're going to have updates in your EHR that's going to impact the workflows on how you get credit for improving A1C pore control, how you get credit for med reconciliation. All of those factors are going to change when you get updates and you get patches, when CMS modifies the language and the requirements behind it. So it's important to start every year with a fresh set of eyes. Look at the measures, evaluate. Just because you reported on this measure last year doesn't mean you have to report on it this year. See what's available. And for quality measures in particular, always have a couple extra in your back pocket. And I say that because CMS will suppress measures. We've seen it happen with breast cancer screening that was impacted by ICD-10 coding. We've seen it with tobacco screening and cessation, which has been impacted by ICD-10 coding, as well as some errors in the logic and the G codes associated with that. So in the event that that happens, you want to make sure you have some kind of flexibility to allow you to shine, because this is a numbers-based program. The higher you score, the better you will get on your payment adjustment. So you may think that it's silly to pick your measures in with that mindset, but it's really important. And this is going to continue to become more and more difficult to avoid the penalty. So every step that you can take to maximize your positive payment adjustment, the better. Use the spec sheets and back them up to how your EHR is certified. This is really important. And then ultimately, pull your data, pull it early. As soon as you get access to pulling reports, pull them monthly if you can, and look and see. We talked about quality improvement earlier in the week. Use those methodologies to drive focused improvements in your performance in those quality measures. That way, you're not just staying at the bare minimum. Every year, those benchmarks continue to rise. For all of those common measures, it's important that you stay ahead of that game. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we do at the REC in particular. So we have a large team of very talented quality improvement advisors, so would be the best way to put it. And we work diligently, as Brent pointed out, to read notice for proposed rulemakings, not just for the quality payment program, but for other programs that touch and impact this program as well. Part of that is making sure that you have tip sheets and one-pagers about that potential impact. We work with local organizations to comment and try and encourage CMS to take the steps necessary, which will help our state, our patients, and our practices across the state supporting those patients. We do monthly webinars, and those webinars we typically focus on different aspects of the quality payment program. And some of those are exclusive. And that's just because that's one of the things that you get for working with us. In addition to that, we help you attest, and then in the event that you're audited, we help with that process as well. Now, in addition, we help do validation with your data. You have a dedicated advisor, but you also have an entire team that helps support that advisor and support your practice. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I've been really excited about, and we just now started to get the feedback reports for 2019. So I do apologize that this data is for 2018. This is the most up-to-date per CMS at this point in time. But we've been doing this for 10 years now, and we have proven success with this program. All of our practices we've worked with have not only met and exceeded their goals, they've met and exceeded our own goals that we've set. That's a little bit higher for them as well. And they have performed better than like practices across the nation. I just think that speaks really highly of the wonderful group of practices we work with in the state. You guys are fabulous. You care about taking care of your patients, and you understand that this program, while it is slightly clunky, is trying to drive us in the process of improving patient outcomes and reducing cost. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we do? This is a good question. Typically, when we're working with a practice, we start with your data. We ask you what you've done in the past. We start asking you to pull reports. We may ask you to pull a report and reach out to your vendor to get specific information on how to validate that. Sometimes vendors are not cooperative, and that's okay. Sometimes they just don't have the same lens that the practice or we have. So in those cases, we typically try to back into that information with our practices. Sometimes that means doing chart audits with the practice to determine, okay, this patient we performed MedRec on and we got credit in the report. This patient we performed MedRec on but didn't get credit for it in the report. What's the difference? And typically if you can back that with the spec sheet, you can determine the actual workflow within your EHR. From there, once we have those reports, we start to validate that information with you, and we perform a gap analysis. And that gap analysis is going to identify potential gaps across the 3 primary categories in this program. So we'll dig in and focus on quality, and we typically start with quality because it has the largest impact on your final score and the largest impact on your potential payment adjustments. Then we move to promoting interoperability. And then finally, we look at those improvement activities in particular. Once we have those outlined, I personally love to dig into feedback reports from CMS with my clients to figure out how are they being evaluated on cost? Are there any potential red flags that we need to kind of consider around those cost performance measures as well? From there, we really form a customized action plan, and we update that action plan monthly when we're meeting with you. And this may look like, okay, reach out to vendor about this, or let's pull a report on this day and send it so that we can update the gap analysis. It's really intended to take something that can be quite burdensome and break it down into bite-sized pieces so that you really can maximize your performance in this program. Now, as I mentioned, you have a individualized advisor. You have one advisor you work with, but then that advisor is actually supported by an entire team. And I like to point that out because we all have different backgrounds. We have people that are, strong in working on telehealth. We have clinicians that are working with us. We have a whole host of folks that bring different knowledge and skill sets that we want to leverage to help maximize your performance. And then, of course, ultimately, we're here to help. So as Brent mentioned earlier, if there's something that you don't know if it falls in kind of one of our service areas, that's okay, just ask. We really do want to be your trusted partner in all quality improvement across the state of Kentucky. Next slide, please. Okay, so I know I covered a lot of information, but I wanted to give a little bit of time for questions. So at this time, I'm going to invite Catherine back on.
Thank you, Kelly, and really appreciate all this information about the quality payment program that affects so many providers. So we have a couple of minutes for questions, and we're going to ask an open question, and then we're going to set up a poll for you also. So one of the questions, and it's really tied to this year, is do we still have to participate in this program with everything going on with COVID-19?
Oh, I wish I could say no, because I know that there's so many things on everybody's plates, and this is just one thing, one hoop that a lot of people don't have time for. Unfortunately, if you're deemed an eligible clinician, you do have to take some type of action. Now, there are some hardships available that we can work through with you to see if you can apply and get approved for one. Those hardship exceptions are kind of reviewed on a case-by-case basis. So I wouldn't bank on getting one of those. The threshold to avoid penalty is relatively low still. So that's kind of one of our very first meetings, is determine what your goal is and how can we meet that goal. We understand that you may not all be trying to go for exceptional performers. You may not even be in your clinics full time right now, and that's perfectly fine. We meet you where you're at and try to help make this as easy as possible, understanding it's not your number one job.
Thanks, I really appreciate that, and I know our listeners really appreciate getting that information. So another question is it worth trying to do more than just meet the minimums each year to avoid the penalty, considering the costs of this program?
Oh, that's a hard question, actually. And it's one that I think you have to evaluate on a case-by-case basis. You have to look and see what is available for you in your practice. Now, the one thing to consider is that every year CMS raises the bar, and they raise the bar to avoid penalty. And we're looking at 9% of potential penalty, and that's quite a bit that most folks can't afford to have taken off the top. If you only do the bare minimum, it will become exceedingly difficult to continue to meet that bar. But you also have to understand that because it's a budget neutral program, you're not going to get a large payout. You're not going to get a huge payment adjustment associated with this program because of it being budget neutral. So it's kind of a balance, to be honest. And it's a hard line to walk, but it's something that we're happy to talk in greater detail with you about because it really is specific to your practice. But don't be discouraged. It is possible to do and perform well on this program in particular without an EHR. Robin Kernel is going to highlight a practice later in the week that has done a phenomenal job without an EHR, and we're so proud of how far they've gone.
That's really great news. Thank you. All right, I've got one more question for you. Our practice is considering moving to a new EHR. What things should we consider in terms of reporting for MIPS while making the switch?
Oh, I wish this was an uncommon situation, but unfortunately, it's pretty common. When EHRs were first rolled out, a lot of them quickly got certified to meet the base meaningful use measures and thresholds and all of that fun stuff. And for those of you that have participated in what used to be called meaningful use program, know that every year it's continued to change. Because of that, a lot of the EHRs were not certified for a ton of clinical quality measures. They didn't really have the functionality that really benefits a practice and their patients. So changing to an EHR makes sense for a lot of folks. So don't get discouraged by that. What you want to consider though is that quality in particular does require a 365-day submission or collection period time. So if you're using your EHR to submit data, you need to figure out a way, so working with a registry, for example, to aggregate the data from both of those systems if that transition takes place in the middle of that performance period. And because we're looking at 365 days, chances are it's going to take place in the middle of a performance period, no matter how you try to plan and prepare for that. The other thing is everything is going to change. So when you move to a different EHR, you're going to have to work on workflows, templates. You're going to want to update and know what quality measures you actually have capable of pulling the information on, what and how it's built in the system, and who does that are all big things to consider. I highly recommend that you go into the transition timeframe with the mindset of, okay, for promoting interoperability, I need to have X, Y, and Z. For quality, I have to have access to quality data. What are your quality measures that you're certified for? What is the process for validation of those quality measures? And what are the steps to take when you don't actually, you find the measure or the report isn't working correctly? Start early, check often, and use your reports to validate every piece and part possible, because it will take a little bit of time and it will be painful, but ultimately people typically move to a better EHR. So long-term, it will benefit your performance in the quality payment program, as well as just your workflows with patients.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for this whole presentation. I know it really helps our providers throughout the state. So this wraps up today, and I want to make sure to mention to you that if you have any questions that you didn't get to put in the chat, you can email us at kyrec@uky.edu.